Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is great for all of us to be here for our stories from the beginning, Sipurei Reshit. Thank you so much for joining us. As we are recording this on Thursday, November 11th, we want to thank all of those who do and who have served in our armed forces. We want to thank them for their commitment to defend and protect our country and all of us within our borders. We are so grateful for your service, and we ask that God continue to bless you and our great country. So thank you all so very much. I am Rabbi Heidi Cohen, and it is an honor to be joined today with Rabbi Daniel Levine and also Rabbi Joe Mendelsohn for this great opportunity for us to study our Torah portions. So who shall I kick it off to first? How about Rabbi Joe?
Hi, I'm Rabbi Joe Mendelsohn. I'm currently the rabbi of the Reformed Temple of Laguna Woods and living in Laguna Woods, that works. I've been a member of the Orange County Board of Rabbis for a number of years, LA born, and came to the rabbinate late in life. So this is just a pleasure to be here and be part of the group.
Great. Thank you so much. Rabbi Daniel, how are you? Good to see you.
Doing well. It's so nice to be back in the Stories from Beginning conversation. My name is Rabbi Daniel Levine. I am the rabbi for Hillel in Orange County and also a rabbinic fellow at Temple Beth Tikvah.
Wonderful. Well, I am Rabbi Heidi, and I am from HaNefesh, OC. So it is great for us to be here. We are a virtual online community, and so we're really kind of everywhere. It is great for us to be able to join together and studying this week's Parasha Vayetzei. How awesome is this? I have to tell you, it has one of my favorite parts in Torah, in which, Jacob has been traveling. Okay, now granted, he's been running away and he has ended up in this place in the middle of the desert. Night has fallen. And the question, of course, later on will be, did daylight savings time end? And so therefore night, came more quickly, or did God actually cause the night to come more quickly just so that Jacob would fall asleep in this one spot? Lay his head there on a pillow of rocks, must have been comfortable at some point, and there had this amazing dream, this dream of a ladder with the angels going up and down, ascending and descending. And he wakes up from this dream and he says these beautiful words of, God must surely be in this place, and I did not know. How awesome, how incredible. To think about those moments, those times in our own lives when all of a sudden we are overcome with inspiration or something overwhelming happens. And we say, wow, God is in this place. A being, something greater than myself is in this place. And I did not know until right at this very moment. So I think it is magical, it is mysterious. And I know, as we were talking beforehand, it can even be a little bit troubling. Rabbi Joe, Rabbi Daniel, tell me a little bit, what do the two of you think about this imagery and this opportunity right now?
The imagery is amazing. And for those of us who believe in God, it is just, so powerful. My problem with the story as it's unfolding is that Jacob has not proven himself to be a person of honor. He has been deceitful with his father, in collusion with his mother. And he's, as you said, he's running away. And, even this recognition of God has a question mark to it in his mind. His connection with God and with his Judaism is conditional still. He's saying, if everything goes the way I want it to go, then I'm going to believe in God. And we cannot do that. It's a real challenge to us to have that kind of putting that kind of a condition on God. I've dealt in chaplaincy for years, and so many people have said, I want a miracle. Well, the miracle comes, but it doesn't come necessarily in the way that you're asking for it. And to put conditions on God just ruins the relationship of saying, I love you and I'm going to accept you for who you are.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things that I always think about Jacob, and Jacob is my favorite character in the Torah for reasons I'll explain in a minute, is because through these 3 or 4 narratives with him, we really see the evolution of a person from really somebody who is not just immature in the sense of him selling the birthright to his brother and tricking his father and all of those things, but somebody who I think to some extent almost fails to recognize the foundational ideas of Judaism. Right? We go a couple parashiyot back, and really the entire point of Genesis is underpinned by this really historically revolutionary idea that all humans are created in the image of God, right? There's no hierarchy. All humans should be considered equal levels of godliness, equal levels of importance. And that's clearly the idea that Abraham understood, wandering around spreading the word. And then we get to Yaakov, who for whatever reason, and, a position that I think, a lot of people make perhaps earlier on in life, get into a position where maybe I'm actually more important than everyone around me. Maybe I'm more important than my brother and I can just, sort of sell him the soup for a birthright. Maybe I'm even more important than my father and I can trick him. And Jacob subsequently running away, you see him wrestling with all these demons, right? The ladders with the angels going up and down is really, one can imagine almost the cartoonish, having the devil and the angel of, a point of intellectual and moral evolution of really trying to figure out, what type of person do I want to be? And he goes on throughout the rest of the narrative, and we can sort of unpack the rest of this parsha perhaps later. But the climax of the Jacob story really actually happens in next week's parsha, where he ends up wrestling with a godlike being, who a lot of the commentators, of course, say that it's himself. But one of the things that this godlike being tells Jacob is Jacob says, well, I've seen the face of God. Another way of seeing that is he's finally understood that every single person, you can see God through them. And when he goes back to Esav, actually a couple weeks later, one of the first things he said to Esav is, behold, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. And so, Rabbi Joe, I 100% agree that Jacob in last week's parsha and the first half of this week's parsha is a very difficult character to redeem. And I think that might actually be the point.
So I want to go back really quickly with that vow that Jacob makes there, that we're wrestling with, that we read here in Genesis 28, where Jacob says, if God will be with me and guard me on this path that I travel, and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return in peace to my father's house, then God will be a God to me. So, it's this really kind of interesting vow. It's like, okay, all right, I see all of this happening, but I'm only going to accept God if God goes ahead and takes care of these basic necessities for me. Take care of me while I'm traveling, make sure that I have enough food, make sure I have clothing, and then return me in peace to my father's house, because he's on this journey right now, right? To go get a wife in Haran. So it's kind of a strange thing. It's like, okay, when is it that we create this? Okay, God, I'll buy it only if, but these are like basic needs and stuff. I mean, why not like something even more extravagant? Hey, if you go ahead and you find me the most perfect wife, or you did it. Why was it just, let's focus on the basic needs?
And why isn't he responsible for himself? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to put it all, God, you have to provide it. Well, this is still the initial, as Rabbi Daniel is saying, this is that initial Jacob before he's grown and gone further.
One of the interesting things that a lot of actual, modern academics point out about the way that religious groups would function in the ancient Near East is that God would only be present in very specific physical places. So we can imagine, ancient mountaintops or even ancient temples, where in sort of a polytheistic world, right, the problem of polytheism being, of course, not that there's more than one God, but that when you try to capture God in something physical, you run dangerously close to humans thinking, maybe I'm more like that depiction of God than you are, and therefore I'm more important. And so Yaakov is actually visibly surprised when he runs into God. And I think an interesting twist on this story, and this is something that Nachum Sarna, the Genesis scholar, points out, is that this is sort of the first time in human history where God is appearing to somebody in a, sort of a religious vision outside of a specific temple. And you can imagine Jacob almost being confused, right? He's saying, I'm not in any place that's specifically holy. And one of the things that he actually has to learn along the way, again, it's a slow learning process. He obviously takes a while to learn with his conditional statement, but he slowly begins to realize, oh my goodness, God, this new tradition that we're trying to spread of ethical monotheism is not confined to any one place. God is actually ubiquitous, and you can find God anywhere. He still has to, surmount that next challenge, which is, the next step of, I think, ethical monotheism is that God is not somebody who sort of, quote unquote, works for us, that we say, hey, God, if you do this, I'll do that. I think he does end up learning that later. But at least that first step of God is not necessarily confined to any one thing or one place, I think is one such leap in Jacob's evolution.
So with that, Rashi goes ahead and explains that the reason why Jacob has to sleep there, and the reason why it's possible that God might have caused the sun to go down even earlier so that he would sleep there, was because that this place would become the place where the temple would eventually be built. So, and what a tremendous place. Obviously, we go back to Abraham and Isaac, right? It was on that spot that we see the Akedah. And now here it is that Jacob is returning to that space and experiencing this, making this vow, like, okay, hey, you can be my God if, and Rabbi Joe, I totally agree. This whole idea of, wait a second, these are basic needs. Why aren't you taking care of your basic needs? Rabbi Daniel, I want to bring up something too that you talked about, which is this idea of God being hamakom, or actually makom, sorry. So when we talk about God, one of God's names is makom, which means place. So that connection, what do both of you think about with this name of God of makom and that connection specifically to place? And is God confined to makom, or God is everywhere?
Yeah, this is one area that I think actually the multiplicity of views in Jewish tradition really comes out at the forefront. And so I'll go, full Maimonides here to some extent, where, my personal view is that whenever we talk about God being in a place, or even the entire idea of the Temple Mount or the Beit HaMikdash, was actually a God concession to human nature. As in, the sort of ideal form would be for every single person to be able to recognize that every place has an equal holiness potential. And I certainly believe that every place has an equal holiness potential. The way that Maimonides reads the biblical narrative, especially, throughout the book of Exodus, is that after the Jewish people left Egypt and they were wandering around, they tried to conceive of this God, this elusive God who was not representative of any physical form. And by the time they got to Sinai, they basically had enough, and they ended up creating the golden calf, not because they wanted to worship a golden calf, but because that was actually their attempt to depict this elusive, mysterious God. And so then on returning down from the mountain, God and Moses sort of get together. I almost imagine them calling a timeout in a sports game and being like, okay, we need to do something. And they say, okay, why don't we actually, set up this tabernacle, the Mishkan, and we can have a way of there actually being a physical-ish representation of a place that God will be, but very much so as a concession, whereas the ideal would be as if one could walk around, and this is obviously a very difficult thing to do, but if one could detach any idea of godliness from anything physical.
We also, even in our own traditions, establish a place for God. Makom HaKavua In the synagogue, we create our own space with God. And that in itself is indicating that God is everywhere, even though there are the communal holy places that are set by our community. We all have the power of creating a Beit HaMikdash at home, in our own space, within another space, making it holy. So we, as quote sophisticated Jews, understand this. I don't think that was really understood back in biblical times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the other things that Jacob comes to represent, at least in the eyes of the rabbis of the Midrash, is he actually comes to represent the Jewish people by way of exile. And so one of the commentaries on the ladder is they say that actually the angels that were descending were the different nations that would come to sort of wreak havoc, quote unquote, on the Jewish people. And the angels ascending were all of the, uplifting times in Jewish history. And I think that, this is almost a perfect analogy, because one of the things that I think allowed Judaism to really thrive in exile is this idea that God is not confined to any one place. And you sort of see this parallel both with Jacob and the Jewish people. If God was only in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem or the Beit HaMikdash, then that would have been it. In the 6th century, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and there actually clearly were Jews in the 6th century BCE who did think, if Jerusalem, if I forget you, how can we praise God in a foreign land? You actually see at the end of that psalm, there's a desire for revenge. We need to wreak revenge on the Babylonians. But there were other thinkers, most notably Jeremiah, who actually said, hey, listen, we can still worship God in Babel. Obviously it might not be the same. The imagery might be different, but the lessons and the morals at the root are the same.
Yeah, and Jacob is, really concerned. I mean, we see that midrash too, just as we were talking about, and Rabbi Daniel, when you brought up this whole idea of the wrecking havoc and so forth, and the Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov, Jacob is a little bit concerned because, wait a second, God's asking, why won't you go up the ladder? And Jacob is more worried about going down. And God tries to reassure him that, no, don't worry. If you go up, you're going to go up. You're not going to go down. So all that balancing, I think, really it's also that, as you said, also, Rabbi Daniel, that whole idea that there's going to be this wrestling next week, especially. And I think Jacob is starting that wrestling right now. He's wrestling with what happened at home with him and his mom, and tricking his father. The fact that he knows his brother Esau is going to come after him, his own wrestling with where he's going to get a wife and continuing that line, and then saying, okay, now I got to wrestle with this whole idea of God as well. And is that going to continue? So it's definitely a portion that is filled with so much.
I
Rabbi,
think the following action, the way this parsha unfolds, I think is really the lessons for Jacob. I just don't feel he's mentally in the place you're describing. I don't think he's really aware of all of those intricacies at this point. I think he's being very conditional. I think he's being very self-centered. His ego is, as we were talking about earlier, that the ego within is so strong at this point. I don't think he's getting all that. I think he has to be shown, as Laban tricks him time and time again, that there's something else going on. There's really that he has power assisting him, that is allowing him to prosper each time and get through these things.
Well, I think we have the benefit, though, of reading ahead, right? We have the benefit of kind of going, we know what's going to be happening within the story. So hence why we then fill in the blanks, with our midrashim and our commentaries and so forth too. So, but we're watching this evolution that is unfolding with us as well.
Yeah, but when I listen to the verbiage of Jacob, I also see it change as time goes on. And to me, that's the reflection of his maturity, of his understanding, just what's going on within the world and within him, and what his responsibility is going to be. When Levine comes to him as he's running away with his wives and all he has, and says, "How could you leave me and take my gods with me?" And he says, "No, if anyone has taken my gods, they're going to be put to death." And of course, he doesn't realize what he's saying at the moment. That will unfold later on. But at this point, he has a completely different way of looking at the ethics of Judaism, of being a human being within a community, and the relationships, than he had at the point that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and one of the things that Jacob seems to embody is a lot of almost ironic dialectics, right? He's described as being a person who sits in tents, and then every single story with him, he is outside of a tent doing something. Even when he's at home, he's outside making stew is really the only time we really see him doing anything. And, of course, he goes on all of these journeys. He's also, described in Jewish tradition and a lot of the Talmudic and subsequently Kabbalistic literature as the representative of emet, of the idea of truth, when, of course, he's probably the most deceptive character in the Torah. And so these dialectics are sort of constantly brewing within him until at the end of the day, either his own, this is happening internally, or this is happening with God, or even a stranger says, your name shouldn't actually be Jacob. It should be one who wrestles with God, with himself. And again, it's sort of this meta picture as the stories in Genesis really representing the Jewish people as a whole. I think that namesake of Israel, of a people who wrestle, regardless of whether or not we're wrestling with big ideas of God and morality, regardless of whether or not we're wrestling intercommunal wrestling and in a positive sense of machloket, of friendly debate about big picture issues, be it questions around Israel, questions around Jewish community. I think Jacob sort of gives us almost a perfect role model, not because he's perfect, but a perfect role model because he embodies this sort of difficult dialectic at his core.
Go ahead.
I agree, even to the point that when we were talking about him meeting up with Esau in upcoming Parasha, when he does, even then they don't go together. He still maintains his distance from Esau and family. He's still busy protecting himself. And this idea that we are allowed to be imperfect and wrestle with ourselves and still be good people, I think is the theme that you're calling upon as we're moving forward.
Exactly. And that's the point too with this, is that when we are reading our parshiot, and as we're going through and we're being introduced by our matriarchs and our patriarchs and all of the stories and the interweaving of all of them, that we also place ourselves in there as well. Right. And our own wrestling, our own trying to understand God, higher power, that which cannot be explained within our own lives and within our own world. And how many of us have been in that place where, if only I had the basic necessities within our lives, the whole idea of food and of clothing and of shelter and of love of family or friends, community, that we all wrestle with those. And so I think that we really see within this parasha and within all of them, we ask ourselves, where are we within this? And how are we experiencing that wrestling and also deeper understanding for ourselves as to where we are and where Makom is and where we are within that story and that latter experience as well.
Amen. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom to both of you. Thank you so very, very much. So Rabbi Joe, it's always great to see you. Rabbi Daniel, thank you so very much. And all of you, we thank you for joining us for this great discussion. We hope that you'll continue the discussion and keep joining us for all of these wonderful stories from the beginning. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.